My grandfather drew his gun against Geronimo and told him not to shoot because they're family. If Geronimo had his way, those two would have never climbed that hill.
The troops are coming after you from all over the United States, one of the scouts said. If you are awake at night and a rock rolls down the mountain or a stick breaks, you will be running. You even eat your meals running. You have no friends whatsoever in the world. I live at the agency, he added. Nobody bothers me. I sleep well. I have my little patch of corn. Geronimo finally agreed to meet with an army officer who outlined the terms of surrender.
In spite of the feelings that Geronimo might have had, the wisdom that came with the Chiricahuas was still a part of his life. I think in the end the wisdom took over, and so he negotiated with the cavalry,
Geronimo and his band would be sent to a prison in Florida. The president himself would determine when they could return home. As the negotiations wore on, the Chiricahuas learned that the Americans had decided to deport their entire tribe. Even the scouts and those living peacefully at Turkey Creek would be sent to Florida. My wife and children have been captured, one of the men said. I love them and I want to be with them. The Chiricahuas began to surrender one by one. Geronimo was the last to give in.
Family? Yeah, that's everything, and that's it. Everything else is secondary.
The whole of our history is primarily of parents and the children and the cousins and the aunts and uncles and grandparents and grandchildren. All of that is integral to Apache communities, the Apache existence. And the men didn't exist in isolation.
On September 8, 1886, Geronimo and his band boarded a train bound for Florida. Like most of the Chiricahuas, Geronimo had never set foot on a train before and had never left the Southwest.
I had a grandfather and a grandmother, along with their children, went on this train. It wasn't their fault.
The Apaches that were on that train felt like it was the end of their time, that the non-Indian was going to wipe them out. This was another trick of the non-Indian world.
When they finally arrived, Geronimo's band was imprisoned alongside Chiricahuas from Turkey Creek and the scouts who had loyally served the U.S. Army. The entire Chiricahua tribe now numbered fewer than 500, just 1/4 of those who had lived free in the days of Cochise. They were all paying a terrible price for Geronimo's brave but stubborn resistance. Families were separated, the men taken to Fort Pickens, the women and children to Fort Marion, more than 300 miles away. Almost immediately, the prisoners began dying of malaria and other tropical diseases.
The humidity, the heat, even the bugs were different, the mosquitoes and everything else, and it's just, to them it was miserable.
Within 3 years, 119 people had died, including Geronimo's wife and 4-year-old daughter.
But the United States almost put that final dagger, should I say, into the hearts of our people. Almost carried out that manifest destiny. In a land, in a place that was worse than San Carlos.
Government authorities took the Chiricahua children to a boarding school in Pennsylvania. School officials cut the children's hair, forbade them to speak Apache, and tried to convert them to Christianity.
And our people were being told, well, that's all over with. You can't go back. Don't clutter their minds with all this old information.
They taught them how to be Western, how to dismiss their religion, how to dismiss their power, how to dismiss the power of their elders.
Tuberculosis spread through the boarding school. Only children dying of the disease were allowed to return to their families. After less than 2 years in Florida, all the Chiricahuas were sent to a prison camp in Alabama, then moved again to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In all, they would spend 27 years as prisoners of war.
What the government did is deplorable, and they should be somehow held accountable.
Even when the federal government finally freed the Chiricahuas in 1913, the state of Arizona refused to allow them to return to their homeland.
Most people in the United States don't realize that there was an entire tribe of people who were imprisoned, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because of who they were.
In a few short years, Americans came to view Geronimo in an entirely new way. When he had first arrived in Florida, crowds gathered at the prison to gawk at the wickedest Indian who ever lived. 8 years later, as Geronimo was being taken from Alabama to Oklahoma, crowds gathered again. This time they came to cheer a national hero. What had changed was America itself. Geronimo's surrender had ended the Indian wars that had raged for nearly 3 centuries.
Once that moment is perceived to be over, there's an almost immediate turn to a kind of nostalgic sensibility. Boy, those were the days, right, when we faced off against these challenging, dangerous Indian opponents. Gosh, I miss those times.
Once the despised savage, Geronimo was now the valiant warrior who had held out against impossible odds.
By the 20th century, Geronimo comes to stand for some of the values we hold most dear in America. The lone battler, the champion of his people, the guy who never gives up, the ultimate underdog. He becomes an icon, a sentimental icon of what was once a real enemy. And there's something amazingly American about that transformation.
While other Chiricahuas were kept under guard, Geronimo was allowed to travel. He attended expositions and appeared in Wild West shows.
Geronimo adopting or seen to adopt American culture represents a major symbolic victory. American civilization has arrived, and even Geronimo is now embracing it.
In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt asked Geronimo to lead his inaugural procession. As the 80-year-old Apache rode down Pennsylvania Avenue, people threw their hats in the air and shouted, "Hooray for Geronimo!" Several days later, Geronimo met with the president and asked if he could return to Arizona. "My hands are tied as with a rope," Geronimo said. "I pray you to cut the ropes and make me free. Let me die in my own country." "It is best for you to stay where you are," Roosevelt replied. "Resentment still burns in Arizona," he explained. "That is all I can say, Geronimo." One day in February 1909, the most famous Indian alive was riding home when he was thrown from his horse. He lay out in the freezing cold all night. When an old friend found him, Geronimo was gravely ill. He died 6 days later, still a prisoner of war. Although Americans celebrated him, Geronimo provoked complicated feelings in the hearts of many Apaches.
We have different perspectives on the man, who he was, how he lived his life, why he did what he did, and how that affected the rest of the tribe.
Apache people suffered because of him. We all suffered with him.
Most of the tribe were angry with him and they blamed him. We don't look at him as a hero.
He wasn't alone. And when these white people think about all these things that were going on, they should name all the group that was with him instead of just Geronimo, because he didn't do it alone.
And then there are a lot of other names also lost in history, lost in the canyons of Mexico, lost in the mountains of the Chiricahuas, names long forgotten.
While other Apaches remained in the Southwest, the Chiricahua had paid dearly for Geronimo's resistance. They were never allowed home.
Well, he killed a lot of people. Why is he remembered when he did all these bad things? It's because he put a mark on the American people. He put a scar on them.
In the end, even Geronimo had regrets. On his deathbed, he summoned his nephew to his side. "I should never have surrendered," the old man whispered. "I should have fought until I was the last man alive."